So first, I just want to welcome everyone. My name is Asher Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of Post-Carbon Institute, the host of today's conversation. Thanks again to all of you for joining us, and thank you in particular to Stacy Mitchell, Dedrick Asante-Muhammad, and Chuck Collins for taking the time to help us understand where we stand here in the United States in terms of growing inequality, the racial wealth gap, the health of local businesses, and particularly what we can do to take back our economy. Now, before we begin, I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge the moment that we're in, the pain, the fear, the loss that so many people around the world are experiencing right now in these really difficult times, particularly those who've lost loved ones, the folks who are risking their own safety to meet the needs of their families and their communities and to fight for justice. I also want to just do some very quick housekeeping. This discussion is being recorded. We'll be sending out to everyone who registered the link for that recording when it's live. We're going to start by asking our panelists some questions, after which we'll have a bit of a back and forth potentially if we have time before going into Q&A. If you have any questions that you'd like us to address, you can submit them by clicking on the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. We did ask folks in advance what questions they had and what topics they wanted us to cover. We've received quite a few comments already, which we've taken a look at. So we're going to try to address some of those. We'll try to do our best to address questions as they come in. Unfortunately, we've received a lot of questions. We just don't have enough time to answer all of them. So I'm going to apologize in advance for not being able to do that. We only have about 75 minutes left, actually 72, I think now, to cover a lot of ground. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to do some very, very brief introductions. And I invite you to check out the work of our panelists, which you can find by going online to the event page, and you can click through on links there. Dedrick Asante-Muhammad is Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, where he oversees our fair housing, fair lending, and small business programs. Stacy Mitchell is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a national research and advocacy organization that fights corporate control and works to build thriving, equitable communities. And Chuck Collins is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. Okay, so now without further ado, I'd like to start with you, Chuck. Can you just give us a brief summary of what we've seen over the last few decades in the US in terms of economic inequality, and also how that's changed as a result of the pandemic?
Sure, thank you for Asher and Post-Carbon for enabling this conversation to happen. And I think it's great that Dedrick and Stacy and the three of us, I think, can kind of help weave the picture that you're talking about here. But, I think your listeners are probably pretty tuned in, to the basic reality that we have become a much more unequal society in the last several decades. And I sort of think of it almost as over the last 40 years, there have been a couple phases of inequality, really starting in the late 70s with the rise of globalization, new technologies, then sort of trickle down economic policies in the Reagan years and other things. But the underlying story is one of stagnant wages, flat or falling wages, really for the first several decades of this period of inequality, for not just the bottom fifth, but really the bottom 70% of workers. Declining sense of security, wealth, savings. And then I think, we had, again, this great recession, 2008, 2009, that not only, hit people's sort of sense of well-being and security and livelihoods, but also fueled an accelerating wealth gap. So there's both income, wages, and wealth inequalities that we're living through. And the last decade has been, I would characterize it as one of surging, accelerating inequality, where the wealth of the bottom half of households has continued to be stagnant or even fallen, more households with zero or negative wealth, and an updraft of wealth, not just to the top 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. households with incomes over 2 million and wealth over 25 million. They have seen the biggest gains in income and in assets. And I'll leave it to Dedrick to kind of put a nice racial lens over sort of that story. And he and I have worked together on sort of trying to tell the two stories of both the, centuries long racial wealth disparities, multi-generational, and the more recent overarching inequality that we're talking about here. We're now at a point now where, the richest 1% probably has 37% of all private wealth, and the top 10% has 2/3 of all, pretty much securities and assets. So then your question, Asher, sort of how has the pandemic affected this? And the first thing I would just say is the pandemic has kind of been, I should say these inequalities were kind of like the pre-existing condition that we entered the pandemic. So, and the pandemic has kind of supercharged those inequalities. So you have a situation where, people who were precarious, who had little savings to fall back on, in access to healthcare and the like, have suffered borne the disproportionate burden of the pandemic. And then those who entered the pandemic with substantial wealth and security have had a very different experience. So now we're in a situation where we're actually seeing, more households depleting their savings, obviously the loss of life, but the loss of livelihoods, debilitating illness, and loss of savings. And I think are going to see another decline in home ownership as more people lose homes and face eviction and that sort of thing. So that's really the unfortunate picture, is the pandemic is an accelerant on existing inequalities. And one of the things that I've been sort of focusing on at Institute for Policy Studies is what's happening at the very, very top. And unlike coming out of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the billionaire class actually lost ground along with the rest of society. They rebounded more quickly, but it took 2.5 years for the billionaire class to get back to the level of wealth they had in 2007, after the Great Recession. And here we're in a situation where, the markets went down, et cetera, but there's been this surge of wealth. So now we have a situation where, I looked this morning, 650 billionaires have seen their wealth go up, over $900 billion since the middle of March. And there are several within that group that are, I would characterize them as pandemic profiteers. Their wealth has gone up anywhere from 300 to 600%, depending on the industries that they're in. And I think this sets up Stacy later, but I think we're seeing a concentration of certain types of businesses and a kind of acceleration of Wall Street power over Main Street businesses and the like. Let me stop there, but I think that sort of tells a piece of the story.
Thanks for that, Chuck. Dedrick, I want to turn it to you. Can you share what the experience has been sort of historically for communities of color, in particular for African Americans here in the United States, and what's happening right now in terms of the racial wealth gap? You're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, so it'd be helpful.
Thanks.
Now you can hear me, hopefully. Very good. Yeah. So I think I'll start off with the way I oftentimes start conversations around this is, how I got into focusing on racial wealth divide so much has been, this interest in racial inequality as a whole. I've done a series of different jobs, from everything from working for Reverend Al Sharpton to working in multicultural centers to working in maximum security prison for women, all trying to look at different aspects of how racial inequality plays out in society and do advocacy to address those issues. And it was actually at my first job around racial wealth inequality, which was actually with Chuck at an organization he founded, United for a Fair Economy, where I was their first racial wealth divide coordinator, that brought together a lot of analysis that I had been reading and seen on the ground around how if the economic structures aren't changed, I do not see I don't see a pathway forward to addressing racial inequality. So I usually start off my presentations at the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide, right? And again, we have to center into, in the space of wealth, and I think wealth is probably one of the best indicators of socioeconomic status and opportunity you have in the United States, and private wealth, because so much of the United States public assets are tied to how well you do with your private assets, versus many other countries that they create opportunity and they try to make things a little bit more equal by bringing in public assets to help subsidize those who have little private assets. And we seem to, whether it's through tax policy or various things, education systems, what have you, attach public assets to private assets, doubling down and increasing inequality. And that's been something Chuck has helped highlight, and others for the last 40 years. We've really been working on strengthening inequality, concentrating income and wealth. And, for African Americans in particular, I think it's been, it's a little bit of a kind of bifurcated challenge or situation, in that I think clearly from 1980 to 2020, I think, you can see some decreases in personal prejudice. You can see some increases in Black representation in, maybe middle income or professional jobs or on TV, these types of things. And you've actually seen some substantive decrease in poverty rates, right? So the actual kind of the lowest income African Americans, you see a little bit more getting out of poverty and kind of being into the totally insecure working class, which I don't know how great in advance that is, but it is something substantive that should be noted. And you've seen substantive increases in educational attainment as well, particularly from 1980 to 2020, helping to bridge college education disparities and almost completely bridging high school graduation disparities. But what we haven't seen is a bridging in wealth inequality, which again, I think is the most important socioeconomic indicator. You're actually seeing a good amount of growth of this type of inequality. For some new data came out in 2019, but haven't broken it out yet. So I still use kind of the 2016 data for median wealth, not using depreciating assets. For Blacks, it's around $3,500 median wealth. 50% of Blacks have less, 50% of Blacks have more. For Latinos, it's around $6,500 median wealth. And for whites, it's around $148,000. So you can see this, massive disparity. African Americans and Latinos make about 60 cents on every dollar that whites make in terms of income, but in wealth only have 2 to 3 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth that whites have. So we see, this deep type of economic insecurity that I think, as Chuck was talking a bit about, when you have crises. I mean, one, kind of every day is a crisis, because you're always, one car repair away, or one ticket away from your household finances of blowing up, if you're lucky. And then when you have some type of pandemic like this, that of course disproportionately affects those who are in the service economy, who are in lower wage jobs that actually interact with people. You're more likely to lose your job, and or you're more likely to be exposed to COVID. And because everything is so much related to kind of socioeconomic status, you also more likely to have health preconditions that make, if you get it, even worse, right? So again, kind of COVID has just tripled down on some of the most negative aspects of inequality, and I think has helped us see maybe actually how, when the economy is going well, you don't notice as much, particularly if you're doing well, the lack of public infrastructure and the kind of weakness of social services as a whole. But in this crisis, I think we're all seeing like the need for these types of things. So don't want to go too much longer, but I will just note that overall for the last 40 years, we're not seeing, and this is what I try to highlight, is that even you might have your first Black president, you have these various things, but you don't see, in most circumstances, the socioeconomic conditions of African Americans greatly improving, and it's definitely not bridging. We've done several reports with Chuck, and some of them have highlighted that if white wealth were to freeze it would have taken another few hundred years for blacks to get to the wealth of whites if white wealth froze, and white wealth isn't freezing, right? And for Latinos, it might not take 300 years, it might only take 150 years, but nonetheless, we're not on a path of bridging economic inequality among the races. We're on a path of it growing continually. And I don't think the country has really wrapped its head around this. I think on the negative side, Trump in office and COVID makes it harder to see that deep threat, because Trump will say such crazy things, and you're having things you never really thought about militias kidnapping governors and people saying outright racist things. It's sometimes going to be harder to identify that the country's been going in the wrong direction for decades in terms of actually bridging inequality. And my final comment will be, and I do think that one of the great challenges for African Americans in bridging racial inequality has been that as African Americans through kind of the mid-20th century civil rights movement, we're getting less outright legal discrimination, maybe strong prejudicial discrimination, and more opportunity in the job market. They entered into a regressive economy where there was just less opportunity for anyone of any race of little income, and even less opportunity for those in asset poverty to move forward. So I think that's been one of the, I think that's been the primary hindrance, is that as African Americans and Latinos are allowed to come to the country the first time, and in large numbers legally, and Asian Americans are coming in, post-civil rights in much larger numbers, we're all coming into, or being more accepted into, a very regressive economy, which is maintaining an inequality that I think many had hoped had been taken apart in the mid-20th century, end of 20th century civil rights struggles.
Thanks for that. That was a really, really good point you made. I want to turn to you now, Stacy. Let's talk about the situation with local economies across the country. We know that globalization and the growing power of large multinationals like Walmart and Amazon have devastated local economies over recent decades. Can you talk a bit about that, and also what has changed since the pandemic?
Yes, that's a great question. And thank you so much for organizing this. It's really an honor to be here. And I'm just so grateful for the work of PCI and the work of my fellow panelists, and for everybody who's tuning in today, for everything you're doing in your communities and for our democracy. There's this period, that Chuck and Dedrick both talked about, the sort of turning point that begins to happen in the 1970s and 1980s, where wages start to stagnate, where we get growing inequality, where the gains that African American families had been making steadily in closing the gap on income between Black and white Americans stop. That stops happening in the 1970s. And that is the same point at which we also begin to get this sharp decline in the number of small independent businesses across the economy and growing levels of corporate concentration. And this is something that has occurred in sector after sector after sector. We can see it, for example, in the food system, where despite the popularity of local food, Walmart has become this just incredibly dominant force. We put out a report last year that found that Walmart is now capturing 1 out of every $4 that Americans spend on food. And in more than 40 metro areas, Walmart has greater than 50% of all grocery spending. Some of those metro areas, big communities, Walmart has 70, 80% of all spending. We've never had a grocer with this kind of dominance, and that power gives Walmart not only the ability to control a lot of the landscape of our communities, but really to dictate up the supply chain a lot about how our food is produced and who produces it. In part because of Walmart's concentration in grocery retailing, we've seen concentration in food processing. And one of the things that we saw in the pandemic were shortages of meat, because there are only a handful of slaughterhouses that slaughter literally all of the nation's meat, basically. And so when one of those went offline because of COVID, suddenly we had these shortages. So this is an economic system that is highly concentrated and not very resilient, and is also an economic system that is not doing the main thing that you need an economic system to do, which is to produce a middle class of people who have their basic needs met and therefore can thrive and participate in a self-governing community. So it has failed on its most basic level. The concentration, has now created this sort of new type of monopoly that has come along that's even more dangerous than the Walmarts of the earlier era, which are the tech giants, companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, which not only are out to dominate markets, but increasingly they control the infrastructure for our economy. They are replacing markets with these sort of private arenas where they're the gatekeepers. They decide which newspapers actually show up in your feed, which business owners and which products actually show up in the search results. It's an incredible amount of power. It's a kind of governing power. They set the rules for commerce. They set the rules for the exchange of information. And act as a sort of a private kind of autocratic government. So this is a more dangerous form of monopoly than we've seen before. We often talk about this set of things that's happened as in terms of all of these forces, as though they're sort of removed from us. So we talk about globalization and technological change and e-commerce, all of these different things. But in reality, this consolidation of corporate power is a result of very deliberate public policy changes that we began to see in the 1970s and particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. Walmart, Amazon could not have amassed the kind of power that they have had it not been for those changes. Had they come along in an earlier era in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they would never have grown into the companies that they are now. We would have had a more dynamic economy, and we would have had more small and locally owned businesses. Chief among those changes were shifts that we made in our anti-monopoly policies and our antitrust policy beginning in the 1970s and then accelerating in the 1980s and 1990s. And this was really driven ultimately by an ideological shift that was embraced by the right and also to some degree by the left, an ascendant faction within the Democratic Party. And that ideological change sort of said, our anti-monopoly laws, our antitrust laws were really about, in their origins and for many decades, were about this notion that you need to disperse economic power. That if you're going to have a strong democracy, you can't have concentrations of private power, and that you need to disperse that power to protect people not only as consumers, but as producers of value, as people who have to work and earn a living, who want to start a business and so on, that they can't be victims of predatory behavior either, that's a problem. In the 1970s, this ideological revolution came along and said, nope, the only thing that matters is efficiency. We should maximize efficiency. And bigger companies are naturally more efficient. It'll be better for consumers, low prices. And so we're just going to unleash these guys. And we deliberately made that choice. And it really came into the fore with Reagan, but Clinton doubled down on it and Obama did too. So we have to reckon with that. And I will just wrap up by saying that that the reason that these companies are so dominant is because of policy, the changes in antitrust certainly, but also a host of other policies as well. And we've really been conditioned not to see that. And so it's really critical that we recognize that Amazon is what it is, not simply because of Jeff Bezos' genius, but because he has taken advantage of and exploited not only these openings in antitrust, but a host of subsidies, tax policies, and other things that ultimately result in your neighborhood independent bookstore paying an effective federal tax rate that is many times what Amazon pays. That's how disparate things have become. And as we lose local businesses, we're losing the basis of our economy, the health of our communities, the ability of people to build wealth and build businesses locally. The pandemic, as both Chuck and Dedrick touched on, has only accelerated all of these trends. We're seeing the worst crisis that small businesses ever faced, and we've lost many, with Black-owned businesses taking the brunt of the hits so far. And within that, I will say, just to kind of end on a hopeful note, is that the pandemic has really revealed a lot of this. I think we've lost the illusion that policy isn't involved. I think we can really see that quite clearly because we saw in the CARES Act earlier this year, literally government picking winners and losers. Big companies are going to get a big spigot of cash. Small businesses are going to have to scramble for these bad loans that are hard to get, and many of them are locked out of. I mean, that was the response. So we all saw it. We had a front row seat. And I think the illusion is now over. And I will say that the last thing, just to go back to the 1970s, that I think part of how this sort of worldview was able to take hold that has been so destructive is that was a period of kind of chaos and confusion. You know, we had oil shock, we had, you know, crazy runaway inflation. People didn't know what was going on. The old system seemed to be broken, and here came this new way of thinking. And I would just note that we are in a point of chaos and confusion now. And so I think there's a real opportunity for all of us to define, what does a new worldview look like that can actually lead us to a better place?
Thank you. That's actually a thread I'd like to circle back to, is just this moment as an opportunity. But before we do that, I want to turn to what are some things that we could do. Now, obviously, you guys have been talking about patterns, trends, policies that have existed for decades, in some cases, centuries, and so there are no necessarily easy fixes. But I would like to sort of explore what are some things that people can do. People listening on this call, or us, more broadly, collectively. So Chuck, I want to start with you. What are some of the top solutions in your mind to reverse the course of inequality in this country, both longer term and in this immediate crisis that we're in right now?
Well, I think building on what Stacy said, I think we start from the premise that we're in this bind, we're in this current both pandemic and economic inequality moment because of the policies and the rules of the economy were designed to a certain degree to create these conditions. And the good news is we can fix that. We can alter the rules. One really important thing, and I think I appreciate the work of Post Carbon Institute, because Post Carbon is looking at, let's try to understand the world through the lens of the disruptions of climate change and the changing energy mix, and the need to transition rapidly away from a fossil fuel economy and from a sort of growth model, an extractive growth model. And I think whatever solutions we're going to talk about, we need to understand we can't really draw on the past. We can't go back to sort of a 1950s, borrow, build, burn, extract economy. We're going to have to come up with a way to reduce inequality in a way that lives within the limits of the Earth's capacity. So I think we need a new playbook. And let me just say, I think there's 3 areas, and I'm not going to really speak to what I would call the democracy reforms that I think are particularly urgent in this moment, just sort of things that we can do to sort of create a political system that's buffered from great concentrations of wealth and power. I think there's a whole bunch of solutions and rule changes that we need in that space. But if you think about, I think there's both things we need to do to kind of raise the floor and create a social safety net. And I think in this moment, as we celebrate essential workers, frontline workers, and I think I like that word, essential workers, because it applies to so many people who are kind of on the front lines and putting their health at risk in various sectors of the economy, and are the most vulnerable, the most underpaid, who have the least access to health care in many cases. So I think that there's, the good news is there's an appetite for a bunch of rule changes that I think would improve the U.S. social safety net, expand universal health care, living wages, things that just create a better standard of decency for everyone. And so that's one sort of category of reforms, rule changes, if you will. The second, I think, are things that just will help broaden opportunity. And again, I think Dedrick will look kind of at particularly the legacy of white supremacy in relation to wealth building, and are there some targeted things and specific things that we might do? But I think there are things around the fact that student debt has become so enormous, that debt in general, that home ownership rates are declining, and particularly for households of color, there's things that we can do to reverse that. And the things that the final category I would speak to are the things that address this concentration of wealth and power, because they tend to be the most challenging, the most controversial. But we're not going to kind of be able to build some kind of localist utopia when there's such an imbalance of power and wealth. And so we sort of, and Stacy, I think, well, I'll leave it to her to sort of talk about this antitrust and anti-monopoly interventions, but I think we're going to have to come up with a populist program, a progressive agenda that includes those kind of things. So I think taxing wealth, taxing very high incomes, recognizing that so much of that the gains have gone to the top 1/10 of 1%. So I'm part of a coalition pressing for, very progressive tax policies. You may have seen that the candidate Biden is saying, look, I'm not going to raise taxes on anybody whose income is below 400,000. All my progressive tax proposals are going to aim higher. I would say they should start much higher up, focusing on the top 1/10 of 1%, a wealth tax on wealth over 50 million, a millionaire surtax on incomes over 2 million. A 10% surtax would generate hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue before anybody middle class pays another nickel in taxes. We should restore the progressivity of the top end of the tax code. That doesn't just generate revenue, it also gets at these distorting concentrations of wealth and power. And that's one of the reasons why we do need to focus on the top. In that context, we also have to look at the vast amount of wealth that's heading to the shadows. I call it the problem of hidden wealth. There's some globally $20 to $35 trillion of wealth that's hiding in offshore systems, hiding in the United States in dynasty trusts and anonymously owned shell companies and luxury real estate. There's a huge amount of wealth in our society, and it's being hidden and for the purposes of taxation and accountability. And there are a number of things that we can do there around corporate transparency and around shutting down some of these loopholes that only the very rich use to avoid taxes. We even need to look at how charity and the philanthropic sector has become another form of concentrated wealth, power, and influence, and reform the charity system so it is less controlled by a small group of wealthy individuals. So those are a couple of the things that I would mention, and a very brief plug for this website that I co-edited called Inequality.org. If you go there, you'll see sort of kind of a list of some of these program ideas and sort of the campaigns that are underway. And the good news is there's a tremendous appetite for the things that I'm talking about. There's very broad public support. It goes across independents and Republicans for wealth taxation, for policies to reduce student debt, for closing the racial wealth divide. There's a popular will to address these inequalities. But we just have to come back to the post-carbon insight, which is we're going to need a playbook where we're building community resilience and reducing our dependence on fossil fuels while we implement these reducing inequality programs.
Thanks, Chuck. I really appreciate that. Dedrick, I want to turn it to you. So it's sort of the same question. What are the top solutions in your mind that would reverse the course of the racial wealth gap, and particularly kind of in the moment that we're in?
Sure. I'm not going to go through the specific ones, but I did write a co-author report with Chuck and others called 10 Solutions to Bridge the Racial Wealth Divide. You can just Google that, and that gets into a mix of policies. But what I would like to note kind of from that is that I think one important thing that we should all be thinking about and organizing around is, if things go well with the vaccine, maybe in a year we'll start pulling out of a COVID recession. And for me, it's important, I think, in terms of racial inequality, but I think Chuck also noted in terms of the environment, that the goal shouldn't be to get back to where we were pre-COVID. right? So yay, now Black unemployment goes down to 7 or 6%, which is white unemployment during a recession. We don't want just to do that. We want to get back to a point where all Americans are at around, a 4%, 3% unemployment rate. So what are we going to do to, as they're talking about, they probably won't do another big stimulus bill to kind of get the economy going or get the economy through COVID. How are we weaving in the sense of racial wealth inequality, dealing with racial economic inequality and making sure racial economic equity is part of this next stimulus? Because we've already spent, because a challenge is we keep spending trillions of dollars and they say we don't have time to look at racial equity, and we just keep reinvesting in maintaining inequality, and then we're all shocked about that. But I think also for this conversation, when we're talking about, getting the economy moving forward again, we're moving forward in what direction? Can we do it not just in an equitable way, but in a sustainable way? And obviously that's going to not be easy fight, but I think those are important things to bring up. Another kind of big frame I want to do around solutions is that, I've been in a lot of conversations around reparations, and I'm a strong advocate for reparations for African Americans and indigenous peoples. I don't think you're really serious about ending a white supremacist economy if you are hesitant or concerned about reparations, particularly for groups. I think that's important, but I also try to argue to some of my colleagues that even a very strong, robust reparations in a super regressive economy is going to have, much less effect than we would like. Like, you can't have an economy where wealth is just constantly being concentrated at the top, income is constantly being traded at the top, business is almost only, for the largest corporations, and then give, even a strong amount of reparations to African Americans and indigenous, and don't expect those people to still just be kind of caught up in a regressive economy. So that needs to be part of the fight for greater racial economic equity, to have a much more progressive economy, and as we're talking environmentally, a sustainable economy. And again, people want to ask, I can give specific policy solutions, but I kind of want to get to these big areas. The one final thing I'll say is kind of more so outside of big federal policy, what can people do in their organizations, locally or what have you. And I have this, frame around identify, develop, and implement and advocate. So when you're looking, the first thing you can do is you can identify the ways the racial wealth divide affects communities you care about, work with, or some part of your life. So first, because we see this racial economic inequality in every nonprofit I've been a part of, right? Or even in organizing efforts. And so, you don't always want to have to wait until the big bill, the big baby bonds bill, or whatever bill you're hoping it gets passed is going to pass. There's action you can take in your community, in your organization, to identify racial inequality, develop and implement policies, procedures, or practices that can help address that, and then advocate even at your local level, even in your organization, right? And it doesn't mean, again, that we don't advocate for the large national policy, but it's just, we have more power, more control within our organization or within our local communities. And those are places where we need to also be doing this work. And I'll stop there. And again, people can look at bridging the racial wealth, 10 policy solutions to bridge the racial wealth divide for specific large federal policies.
All right, thanks, Dedrick. Stacy, let's turn it to you. Same question, I guess, regarding solutions to strengthen and bring back local and small businesses.
Yeah, it's great. These are just really useful. I couldn't agree more with the comments of Chuck and Dedrick. So the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we do research and analysis on this set of problems, and we also develop policy and partner with grassroots organizations to implement those policies. And so we work across a number of different sectors. You've heard from me today about our independent business work, but we also have an energy program and a broadband program and a number of other areas of work, all of which are really great sources of policy ideas. We work at both the national and the local level, so we're pushing stuff nationally around trying to shift some of these big structural things. At the same time, we provide a lot of tools and policy ideas for people to engage directly in these issues at the local level. Dedrick talked about the importance of like the COVID response, especially, maybe if we have a new administration in Congress next year. I think I just couldn't agree more with this idea that we cannot simply continue the path that we've been continuing in this pandemic of providing stimulus that reinforces the existing problems, the big structural problems in our economy, and makes them worse. Like, we have to use this moment to actually use that spending and those policies to redress these deep problems around racial inequality, around concentrated corporate power, and so on. We've been working really hard on that, and really believe that going into, if we have a new Congress next year, that's got to be a priority to think about how that bill is structured. And the other thing that I will point out at the national level that we've been working a lot on, and I think is very much intertwined with how we recover from this crisis, which is helping to lead a growing anti-monopoly movement with the goal of reinvigorating our antitrust laws, and also getting Congress to restructure our highly consolidated markets. Congress used to have a strong hand in anti-monopoly policy. Every so often it would come in and adopt new laws to deal with new problems around concentrated power or address specific issues within certain industries. And for about 50 years now, it's done absolutely nothing on this front, and allowed the regulatory agencies that oversee our antitrust laws to become further and further removed from the public interest, and to really weaken antitrust law in a number of ways. So we've been part of a broad set of organizations, including labor groups, small business groups, and others who are pushing to reinvigorate the antitrust laws. The good news on that front is that last week, a congressional committee, the Judiciary Committee in the House, its antitrust subcommittee, released the findings of a 15-month in-depth investigation into big tech, into Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. The evidence that they gathered is substantial and shows extensive market power abuses and serious consequences for working people, local businesses, and communities of this concentrated market power. More importantly, their report, which is brilliant and very readable, though 450 pages long, also includes very strong policy recommendations, including that Congress pass a law that would entail the big tech companies actually having to spin themselves off, to break themselves up into different components, as well as reinvigorating the antitrust laws and the agencies that enforce those. So it's a very exciting moment. I feel like we've come a long way in this fight to actually have a congressional committee calling for those things. So yeah, we've been working really hard on it, and we're really thrilled with the report. It couldn't be better. The investigation has been bipartisan. And although the Republicans, there was somewhat of a split among the Republicans in the report, which was issued by the majority, a group of Republicans issued a simultaneous report that agreed with all of the findings, had a little bit of different ideas around the solutions, but said that these companies are, quote, fundamentally anti-competitive. So it's a pretty big deal that this has happened, and I would really encourage people to follow it, but also to make your member of Congress aware that this is happening and that you're watching it, because this, I think, is one of the most important opportunities that we have in the coming months to actually attack this problem of corporate power head on. And these solutions, I should say, would not only affect the tech companies, but because we would reinvigorate antitrust law overall, we would now have a new set of tools to address concentrated power in ag and drugs, all the other places that we see it in our economy. And I can't emphasize enough, from answering your first question, just how much anti-monopoly policy set alongside strong labor laws to make our economy more equal. The period of time in the mid-20th century, of course, those laws also in various ways excluded African Americans, people of color, and women. So, we need to come at this, we need to have an anti-monopoly movement that's an anti-racist movement, and that's really what we're trying to build going forward. So I don't want to glorify that part of the past, but to say that we did have some strong tools that helped us with these kinds of issues that have been dormant, and we're on the cusp maybe of being able to bring them back. And then lastly, just to touch on some of the things that we're working on at the local level. There are lots of tools that states and cities have for strengthening their local economies and sort of rebuilding a more equitable and sustainable economy at the local level. We put out in July a toolkit called Fighting Monopoly Power: How States and Cities Can Beat Back Corporate Control and Build Thriving Communities, which is a mix of policies across different sectors of the economy: food and agriculture, retail, banking, all sets of tools that are available at the local and state level. And we also put out a guide for communities around safeguarding small businesses during the pandemic, so helping your local businesses actually weather this unprecedented crisis. That's called 26 Strategies for Local Leaders, and features programs from across the country that are actually working very well, including programs that target particular business segments, such as Black-owned businesses and so on. So a really good guide to what is the best thinking and work that's going on both those fronts. To highlight a couple of the things that are in the Fighting Monopoly Power guide, we talk about the potential of public ownership of commercial buildings, so community land trust used for commercial spaces, investment co-ops and the like, as a way to actually gain control of the real estate in our neighborhoods and make sure that that commercial real estate is used by businesses that are generating the right kinds of benefits for our communities, and that are locally owned and helping to build local wealth. We also do a lot of work on publicly owned broadband. We've helped hundreds of cities across the country build public fiber networks that provide high-speed internet at lower cost. And lastly, I think one of the biggest opportunities that we highlight, well, two last things. One are public banks, which we can talk about a little bit more, but are really crucial and probably many in this audience are familiar with. And then lastly, cities and counties and other local government units spend upwards of $90 billion a year subsidizing big corporations in the name of economic development. Just extraordinary expenditure of money. And so you begin to imagine, like, what could you do with those funds? How many startup businesses or urban agriculture initiatives, or you name it, community solar ventures, could you provide grants and startup support to if we redirected those funds? It just seems to me a really critical opportunity, and really devastating to realize how much we spend on that, in the face of essential workers not even having proper protective equipment or decent wages.
Thanks, that was great, Stacy. And I'll just mention as a quick note, you guys have brought up a number of resources that your organizations have put together. We'll do our best to see if we can compile those and share those out when we send out the recording of this. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we've gotten from the audience. But before I do that, I guess I want to flag something that I'm wrestling with myself, just listening to you guys and thinking about these issues. It seems like, and all of you have actually pointed to this, of sort of looking at the larger system, right? So you've talked about, Chuck, you talked about an economy that has to live within kind of the biophysical, ecological limits of the planet. Dedrick, you talked about addressing the racial wealth divide, but can't do that within an economic system that's basically funneling everything up to the wealthy. So, and Chuck, you'd actually mentioned something about tax policy, right? So, and there are two things there. One is having a more progressive tax policy, but at the same time addressing the fact that people are offshoring their wealth or hiding their wealth in places. And so, and what I'm trying to get at is that for the folks listening, how do they think about the way to engage? Because when you start unpacking this stuff, you see that these are structures that exist within this larger system, right? And so, for example, on the tax side, can you have a more progressive tax policy without addressing the fact that it's easy for people to offshore their money? Is not money just going to go away? So how do you guys think about, in your own work, focusing your efforts? Is it more strategic to focus on sort of one part of this larger system to try to move that piece forward? Is it really important to think about the whole system and try to make connections between these issues and bringing different constituents together? I'm just going to open it to all of you, anyone who wants to respond to that question. Hopefully it made sense, the question.
Yeah, I'll go forward with, I mean, one thing I do is I look for opportunity, because I do feel that there has actually been a lack of progress in so many areas that if, there's an opportunity, if a congressperson wants to talk to me and, talk about some big federal policy piece, great. If even if a corporation, this is again talking about racial economic inequality, wants to talk to me, or a nonprofit about what can they do in their day-to-day operations to better address racial economic inequality, I usually see huge issues that need to be dealt with, at a corporate level, at a nonprofit level, or at a policy level. So I'm willing to kind of engage in any of those spaces, because I do believe that, even with the large structural policy challenges, we have to have a strong consciousness raising and really understanding of the problem. I think too oftentimes people try to just push forward a policy and not do the education so that people understand why we want this policy to move forward and what results we're hoping to get. And if you don't have that, then there really is no follow-up. And because usually no one policy is going to solve everything. Almost everything, the biggest policy we want is just one step forward to do more. But if there isn't that understanding that there is this huge issue, which is why I spend so much time focusing on the reality of racial economic inequality, the reality of the racial wealth divide, and how the country is actually on a path of ongoing economic apartheid. If people don't really understand that, and they just are supported of a baby bonds program, they're not going to be willing to do the next steps afterwards. So I don't have one big strategy that you have to do this before you do that. I'm just looking, where can I get some progress? Because being frozen at all spaces does not help anything move forward, and actually really makes people feel like there's no change that is possible. So I think a lot of it is trying to encourage people or let people see that there is some substantive change that can occur that's going toward a bigger goal.
Thanks. Stacy or Chuck?
I think one of the real challenges, opportunities is how do we've been conditioned, I think, to think of ourselves primarily as consumers. And so one of the things I encounter a lot in talking about corporate power or the problems with different companies is, people will read my work and writing about Amazon and they'll say, well, that's terrible, I'm going to cancel my Prime account, or let's boycott Amazon. And that's a very, I think that's a very powerless place to be. It's very hard to make change by trying to aggregate our decisions as consumers to actually, I think corporations have sort of won when we're in that kind of mindset. And we've lost our citizenship muscle. We've sort of lost touch with, how do we actually exercise our voice as citizens? And it's part of the, it's in some ways an outgrowth and furthers the sort of demise of local economies and the fraying of community institutions, is that people, don't belong to civic organizations the way that they used to. They don't attend public meetings the way that they used to. Local newspapers are disappearing. The places where we used to gather are gone. And so just the mechanisms of being a citizen and engaging with our neighbors collectively to try to solve problems have really withered. And so I'm really thinking a lot, and I don't have any great answers, but I've really been thinking a lot lately about how do we rebuild that? How do we learn to, when we see a problem, not to respond in terms of trying to be a conscientious consumer, but rather in being a citizen that is part of a self-governing society and therefore responsible for working with our neighbors to address that through political means.
Thanks, Chuck. Do you have a?
I would just quickly build on, I think I love what Stacy's saying about kind of rebuilding our civic muscle. And Dedrick, thinking about what are pressure points, that's the same, similar, these are big system changes. There are some pressure points, though, that begin to kind of rewire the economy, shift power. we haven't used the phrase Green New Deal, but I think there's a number of policies that I would put under that to say, well, if you tax the bads, if you taxed, excessive consumption and fossil fuel use, and you directed that money toward retrofitting public buildings and sort of green infrastructure, and you designed the preferences for companies that were broadly owned or worker owned, and that paid living wages, all of a sudden you kind of have an intervention that gets at a bunch of different systems. Similarly, you tax wealth, inherited wealth, the estate taxes, and you invest in debt-free higher education, and maybe you connect that to, you do 2 years of national service and you get a free higher education and free vocational training and whatever skills you want to build. Well, you're reducing the concentration of wealth, you're creating opportunity, you're reweaving the civic and social fabric. So I think there are some pressure point interventions that do help move us towards system change, to help us rewire the economy and our civic infrastructure. And a lot of them are in the area that I think Stacy's really been a pioneer in. What does the transition to a new economy look like? How do we, build a new food system? How do we regionally reduce our global exports and imports and produce more for local consumption? All those are the kind of things that I think are going to help us move and address these sort of multiple system failures, including, Stacy's working around banks, state banks, regional banks. That's the credit and capital component of this. And I would just say one other thing in this pandemic moment, that there are fights ahead over how, right now things are completely stalled out. You have a completely dysfunctional Senate in terms of, kind of responding to this COVID, recession. But there's a potential that, even with the Republican continuation of Republicans, they're going to have to do something. So then the question is, are they going to give more bailouts, as Stacy says, to the large corporations, or should we really fight for those to be fundamentally designed? If you think about it, they gave billions of dollar bailouts to the Potbelly restaurant chain, these national restaurant chains. And if you look at what they did in the UK, they said, well, we're going to just match dollar for dollar everybody's local consumption from local restaurants. So here's United Kingdom is basically saying, we're going to do a bottom-up stimulus. We're going to put money in people's pockets that they can take to their local favorite local independent business and restaurant and keep them going, instead of we're going to keep some big old corporate giant that just has a lobbyist alive. So I think there's, even in terms of how we move forward in the coming weeks and months around pandemic response, there's ways we can influence the direction of that.
And I just want to add one more thing, that I also think that, optimistic note, I think there's more of an understanding that there are these large structural problems, and that there's a massive climate change, environmental problem. There's a massive problem in our economy with inequality that we've been hearing about ever since, hearing it for a long time, but with kind of 1% movement and these things. And then in the midst of all this, the kind of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, understanding of racial economic inequality. And I think it's unusual for America to be able to see several large systemic problems all at the same time, in a general understanding that they all need to be addressed. And I think even, part of our report for 10 policy solutions to bridge the racial wealth divide, that came forward because I've never seen, Democrat nominees put forth so many bold policy proposals around addressing racial economic inequality. So I think there is definitely a movement in the country for big change and recognizing there's big problems. And the question is, how are we going to help harness that in a positive direction? I think Trump has done a great job in harnessing it in a more negative direction, but there still is that understanding of the need for change, and how are we going to help guide that over the next few years?
Yeah, I really like the focus on thinking about being opportunistic and also looking at ways maybe to use a permaculture principle, which is like stacking functions, thinking about solutions that address multiple needs, and helping people understand kind of the systemic changes that need to happen. I want to get to one question we got here, which is sort of political and at the policy level. If Congress does end up being deadlocked once again, what can states do for greater economic justice and building out new small businesses that conform to a more just world? So I guess thinking of it maybe at the medium level, from the local to the federal, at the state level, what can states do? Any thoughts on that?
I can jump in with a few ideas there. There's a lot actually that states can do. States have an incredible amount of authority and power. And in our work, we've highlighted some really striking examples. Starting up a state-owned public bank is a really important thing to do. North Dakota, as many people know, has a public bank that was launched over 100 years ago. North Dakota today has more local banks and credit unions than any other state per capita. Over 80% of all of the banking deposits in the state of North Dakota are held by local community banks and credit unions. Nationally, it's maybe about 20% or so. It's just dramatically different in North Dakota. And when you look at what's going on there, what you see is that there are far more loans going to local farmers, small businesses, startups, community enterprises, and development of all kinds. And that is because those local institutions are strengthened by having this relationship with this state bank that functions as a kind of wholesale bank. It expands their lending capacity and in various ways enables those local privately held banks and credit unions to be more robust and keeps the big banks at bay. It's a really great model. There are a number of cities that are looking at it at a municipal level. It can also be done at a state level. And to stick with North Dakota, just as another interesting example, North Dakota has banned pharmacies owned by chains. You can't have a pharmacy in North Dakota unless you're a pharmacist, and which means that there are no pharmacies in Walmart stores in North Dakota, no CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens. It's all independent, locally owned pharmacies. And it's a really interesting test case, because the idea we have in our minds is that, small can't compete. Well, it turns out that North Dakota has more pharmacies per capita than any other state. If you live in a very remote, small community in North Dakota, you're twice as likely to have a local pharmacy than if you live in a similar remote community in South Dakota. North Dakota has among the lowest prescription drug prices anywhere, and there's evidence that these local pharmacies provide better health care and nurture their local economies in different ways. That's simply a state law that did that. Europe has similar kinds of laws, but North Dakota is the only state that has it. Vermont has great models. Vermont has very few big box stores relative to other states because they have very strong land use policies. And we're seeing, a lot of places that are figuring out ways to redirect their economic development dollars. Portland, Oregon, for example, their Economic Development Commission has shifted part of what it's doing away from kind of big companies and bigger projects and said, what does it look like if we nurture local entrepreneurs? And what if we specifically focus on entrepreneurs of color? Like, what are the support services that they need? And it really seen good results with that kind of initiative. So there's lots out there. Publicly owned broadband, I mentioned. Our energy system is going through a big transition to renewables, and that's an incredible opportunity not only to switch to renewables, but to cut out these dominant monopoly utilities with their pollution and instead have distributed community-owned solar and wind. That decision-making is very little of that's federal. It's almost all at the state level, and there are some states, as we've documented, that have much better policies than others. So there's a lot that we can do there, and I think the one last thing I'll say is that by focusing on these issues and doing that work at the local and state level, and being sure to do it within a framework when we're working in our communities of the broader sort of structural problems that are being solved and the challenges of monopoly and so on. By doing that, we actually begin to, I hope, build a constituency and a sort of grassroots power that will give us more leverage at the national level to do that work.
Thanks. Dedrick, this is a question for you, and I just want to be mindful we have about 10 minutes left, which is really around how can individuals address, we're talking a lot about policy solutions, and what I'm hearing from all of you guys is that we need to be engaging as citizens at all levels in order to shift negative policies in the right direction. But as individuals, not being consumers so much, but using their dollars or their access or privilege, how could they actually think about addressing the racial wealth divide, whether it's in their community or more broadly?
Yeah, I will just kind of restate this identify, develop, and implement, and advocate, because I really do think that is it. It's like, and for each individual in very different circumstances, some of us run organizations, some of us are parts of organizations, what have you. So I don't know, where you are in leadership in terms of maybe, in a civic organization, your local church, what have you, however you're engaged. Identify ways that racial wealth divide, affects your communities. And when you're identifying, what ways can you get involved? Like maybe you don't run anything, you don't run a local organization, but you see some, serious distance between some of the public assets in your area and how they're connected to, immigrant Latino community or local African-American community. Well, how can you as a local resident help connect and make sure these public assets are more broadly shared? Or if you have greater access, how can you use that privilege to help others? So, identify the ways that racial wealth divide is affecting the areas you're connected to, and identify with that how you can engage that, and then and that is part of that, develop and implement policies, procedures, or practices that can address that. And then sometimes you got to advocate, because you can do some things. You're able to get your friends to do a few things, but you're always going to have to get more people to come forward, and that's going to be part of that advocacy. So unless I had more of a specific example, I don't know how to give more specific recommendations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I want to, and unfortunately we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I want to just give each of you maybe a couple minutes to share any closing thoughts or recommendations you have. Just again, thinking about, for our audience, these are people who want to know, they want to know what they can do. So, what would be your recommendations for them in terms of a specific resource to go check out, and any other closing thoughts you have? Maybe Chuck, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we knowing that this is a Post-Carbon Institute seminar, I think I would just remind us that, there's a foundational work, which is building local community resilience, doing everything we can to sort of protect and control the commons around us, against sort of the excesses of extractive capitalism. So whether that's our ecological commons of the land, the water, the air, the natural resources, protecting that, but also the social commons, the institutions, the networks that we're building, the technological commons. Those are all meaningful and important fights to be part of. So, I think the transition town movement, the community resilience efforts, all of that, I think, are foundation. Being part of that sort of face-to-face group that's thinking about, like what Stacy's talking about, how do we do transition to more distributed energy? How do we have a more regional, local food system? How do we create, more broader ownership of employee and worker ownership in the economy around us? So those are all, I think, things. And I would just invite people to check out the work at inequality.org, which is the website that I co-edit. And we put out a newsletter every Monday that you can sign up for there, and it comes from me. And it's attempt to talk about, both these system changes, but what is it that people are doing? What are the campaigns that people can be part of? But I would say, and it's hard to do this during a pandemic, but but form a crew, form a group. If you're not part of an existing association or organization, find a couple people to come together to, look at how to make changes in these different areas. Create kind of a support group for the next 2 years, which I think are going to be a period of great upheaval and transition. And I think it's going to call on us, all of us, to be engaged in part of the moment we're in. So, prepare ourselves starting today for the next couple of weeks, which are going to be a kind of a roller coaster, but then think about the next couple of years as a transition point, as a real period of potentially growing change.
Thanks. Dedrick, what are some closing thoughts from you or recommendations?
Yeah, building off the previous question and what Chuck was saying, I mean, I do like this idea of people already working on kind of local resilient communities, kind of taking this to what I was saying before. Well, if you're building these local resilient communities, how are you making sure that you're not replicating the racial inequality or just economic inequality that is in society as a whole, and being really intentional in that. Also, something else that Chuck said that reminded me of previous conversations I've had with Chuck, this is a time of crisis for so many. And it's not a crisis that's going to go away in a couple of weeks. It's ongoing crisis. This would be an ideal time to really develop some type of like mutual aid work, right? Where you can actually, because of kind of concentration of wealth and racial inequality, our communities are so segregated. Like, here's an opportunity, oftentimes in times of need, is a time where people could come together and you can really build some stronger foundational relationships that can, be supportive of strengthening relationships, but also strengthening communities. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And the final thing I'll just say too is, I do think this is a pretty profound ongoing moment. I mean, the way this is going to be, the way it's already affected entrepreneurship, but the way it'll continue to affect entrepreneurship and shut down so many small businesses and actually change even the workforce, as so many companies are moving toward, having less and less employees and making things automatic in the name of COVID, but they're already doing that anyway, that there's going to be all of this change. And so how are we engaging in the change, being proactive and moving it toward a vision we want, not just the way that corporations can best profit during this moment.
Thanks. Stacy?
It's great. A couple of things. So we helped found a coalition called Athena, and it's a national coalition of more than 50 labor groups, small business groups, community organizations, and others, and individuals that can come together, really leading the fight to address Amazon's power and sort of wrest back our democracy and our local economies from Amazon and Jeff Bezos' incredible wealth. So doing a lot of work on the monopoly issues I talked about, but also helping to support a lot of the organizing that's going on among workers at Amazon warehouses and so on. And that's Athena. It's at athenaforall.org, and you can join and get on the list there to get updates. And then if you're interested in some of our work, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, ilsr.org, or find us on Google. If you go to the independent business section, you'll find links to a lot of the kinds of things that I talked about. And if you're on the independent business section on the right there, sign up for our newsletter. We will be sending out in the next couple of days sort of summary of the House investigation that I talked about and links to that report and so on. And we can include that report in the resources that PCI sends out as well. But if you want to get involved in that fight and stay abreast of it, signing up for our newsletter is a great way to do that. And then you can find all the other tools and how-to stuff for the local and state stuff as well on our site.
Great, thank you. Well, we're just about at time. I really want to thank the audience for taking the time to join us. I particularly want to thank the three of you, Dedrick and Stacy and Chuck, and encourage everyone to go check out the work of the organizations that the three of you are involved with. So check out the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, check out ILSR, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, check out Institute for Policy Studies and Inequality.org. And just a closing thought is that there is opportunity. There's a lot of difficulty and challenge, but a lot of opportunity in this moment as well. Let's make the most of that opportunity and recognize that it's much more a marathon than a sprint. to build the world that we want coming out of this crisis that we're in. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing.
Stay healthy.